Just think, could a single substance have changed history, saved millions of lives, yet simultaneously been responsible for the deaths of millions? That substance isn't the atomic bomb, nor is it a virus. That substance is ammonia. How can one chemical equation fundamentally transform the world? Today, we will examine an invention that is responsible for the survival of nearly 1 out of every 2 people on our planet, yet also ignited the fuse of modern warfare. This is the story of a genius scientist and the dual legacy of human ingenuity. This is the story of the Haber-Bosch process. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was on the brink of a crisis, the nitrogen crisis. Nitrogen was vital for both food production, fertilizer, and the manufacture of explosives, gunpowder, and ammunition. At the time, nearly all of the world's nitrogen supply came from massive saltpeter, nitrate, deposits in South America, particularly Chile. Europe's farmlands and armies were utterly dependent on this resource. But these natural reserves were running out. Scientists knew that if a solution wasn't found, civilization would either collapse due to famine or be unable to produce the ammunition necessary to fight. The solution lay in the atmosphere itself. Approximately 78% of the air around us is nitrogen. The challenge was finding a way to take this abundant, yet extremely inert gas and convert it into a usable compound, ammonia. The man who took on this mission, Fritz Haber. In 1909, the German chemist Fritz Haber achieved the impossible in his laboratory. Using high pressure and high temperature, he managed to combine nitrogen from the air with hydrogen to produce ammonia. However, scaling this process from a laboratory experiment to industrial production posed a massive engineering challenge. This is where the engineering genius, Carl Bosch, stepped in. Bosch took Haber's lab thesis and adapted it into large-scale steel reactors. The Haber-Bosch process was born. The potential of this invention was limitless. The threat of global famine had been averted. Yet, the timing and geography of the discovery altered its fate. The invention was made in Germany, just before the outbreak of World War I. And Germany would use this process to survive. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Allied powers, especially Britain, quickly cut off Germany's supply of nitrate from Chile. Without nitrate, the primary ingredient for ammunition, experts estimated that Germany's war would last a maximum of 1 year. But the war did not end as predicted. Thanks to the Haber-Bosch process, Germany defied the naval blockade and continued to produce its own explosives from ammonia. Fritz Haber's invention became the lifeline of Germany's war effort. The war was prolonged for years due to this single scientific breakthrough. This is the peak of science's moral dilemma. Fritz Haber not only ensured the continuation of his country, but also actively participated in chemical weapons projects that led to his wife's tragic suicide. He famously argued that, in peacetime, the scientist belongs to the world, but in wartime, he belongs to his country. The Haber-Bosch process first served death, but shortly thereafter, it would offer humanity its greatest gift yet. When the war ended, Germany's massive ammonia plants were not shut down. The factories switched from producing explosives to producing nitrogen fertilizer. This was the beginning of the era known as the Green Revolution. Fertilizers increased the yield of farmlands to previously unimaginable levels. Land that once fed 1 person could now feed 2, or even 3. Famine was being driven from the world stage by scientific achievement. The Haber-Bosch process laid the foundation for the demographic explosion that saw the global population rise from 4 billion to 8 billion. Without this invention, the modern world as we know it would not exist. Nearly half the world's population owes its life, directly or indirectly, to that chemical reaction that began in Fritz Haber's laboratory. The Haber-Bosch process taught humanity what it means to wield a double-edged sword. The same chemical process, developed by the same genius, simultaneously prolonged a war that ended millions of lives and saved billions of others from starvation. This invention leaves us with a profound ethical question inherent in the nature of science. Can the technology that offers humanity its greatest gift also bring about its greatest destruction? Today, we are alive because of this process, and our fields are fruitful. But behind every synthetic fertilizer bag stands that fine, historical line between scientific genius and ethical responsibility. Remember, history is written not just by kings and wars, but by a chemical reaction that occurred quietly in a laboratory, changing everything about the world. The steel box revolution. Look around you. The phone in your hand, the shoes on your feet, the coffee machine on your counter. Nearly every manufactured item you own has spent time inside this. A simple, corrugated steel box. It is uniform, stacked high on colossal ships that traverse the oceans, yet it is rarely noticed. It carries no data, uses no electricity, and relies on no complex software. Yet, this humble steel container, invented barely 60 years ago, is the true engine of modern globalization. It didn't just change shipping, it shattered centuries of economic tradition, erased thousands of jobs, created trillion-dollar supply chains, and completely redrew the industrial map of the world. This is the story of how the quest for efficiency by a single truck driver led to the creation of the global assembly line. Before 1956, international trade was defined by chaos. Goods arrived at the docks in a myriad of shapes and sizes: jute sacks, wooden crates, steel drums, and cotton bales. The process of transferring cargo from ship to dock was known as break bulk shipping. It was excruciatingly slow, incredibly dangerous, and astronomically expensive. Hundreds of dock workers, or longshoremen, would spend days, sometimes weeks, manually hoisting, sorting, and res-tacking every single item. Labor costs alone accounted for as much as 75% of a ship's total voyage expense. A ship often spent more time waiting in port than it did sailing the ocean. This logistical chokehold kept international trade expensive and local economies insulated. The man who saw the inefficiency wasn't a naval engineer or an economist, but a trucker named Malcolm McLean. In the 1930s, McLean grew frustrated waiting for his cargo truck to be unloaded at the New Jersey docks. He asked a simple, revolutionary question: why don't we just load the whole truck trailer onto the ship? In 1956, McLean launched the Ideal X, a refitted oil tanker carrying 58 custom-built steel boxes from Newark to Houston. It was a modest test, but the results were staggering. The cost to load 1 ton of cargo plummeted from $5.86 to just 16 cents. The container was revolutionary because of its simplicity and its standards. It was designed to be intermodal. It could be seamlessly transferred from a truck chassis to a train car, and then stacked on a ship, without ever having to open the box itself. The barrier to global trade had finally been broken. The container solved the logistical problem, but it created an immediate and brutal labor crisis. The technology that saved global commerce killed traditional port work. A single automated crane, operated by 2 or 3 workers, could now do the work of literally hundreds of longshoremen. The human connection to the cargo, the deep knowledge of where every crate lay, was obsolete. All that mattered was the standardized box and the machine that moved it. In port cities around the world, from New York to London to Hamburg, massive labor strikes and protests erupted. Dock workers understood that their livelihood, passed down through generations, was being eliminated by a machine-driven efficiency they couldn't fight. But the economic pressure was unstoppable. Ports that refused to adopt containerization, like the historic docks of the London port, simply died. The container forced a radical restructuring of the waterfront, driving ports out of cities to vast, automated complexes that prioritized space and speed over human labor. The steel box became the ultimate symbol of automation and creative destruction, proving that technology always triumphs over traditional work structures when the financial incentive is strong enough. With transportation costs effectively neutralized, manufacturing decisions were no longer tied to proximity. Why produce goods in expensive labor markets like the US or Europe when you could produce them where labor was cheapest? The container was the ultimate tool for arbitrage. It created the global assembly line. Companies could now source materials from Africa, manufacture components in China, assemble the final product in Mexico, and sell it in the United States, all while the container maintained the seamless flow. The cost of shipping a typical toy or item of clothing across the ocean plummeted to pennies. This fueled the rise of Asia as the world's manufacturing center. The container made it economically viable to ship empty containers back and forth, driving down the final price of consumer goods and accelerating the age of mass consumption. The vast majority of products we buy today exist because the container made the distance between the factory and the consumer economically irrelevant. The simple steel box is, in fact, the physical backbone of the Made in China label. The shipping container delivered a world of unprecedented choice and affordability. It is a monument to the simplicity of genius. Yet, its legacy carries a heavy price tag. The container enabled the environmental strain of massive international shipping, the ethical dilemmas of relying on distant, unregulated labor markets, and the creation of a vast, globalized system prone to single points of failure, as recent supply chain disruptions have starkly shown. The steel box revolutionized our material world, bringing the four corners of the globe onto our store shelves. But in doing so, it forced us to ask, what are the true environmental and human costs of an economy built entirely on the principle that everything, everywhere, must be moved cheaply and quickly? The legacy of barbed wire. It is arguably the simplest, cheapest, and most brutally effective security technology ever invented. It requires no electricity, no maintenance, and no guards. Yet, this unassuming strand of twisted metal has done more to shape geopolitics, define private property, and dictate the course of modern warfare than almost any other invention. It is barbed wire. Its history is a paradox. It was invented to protect corn from cattle in the American heartland. But it quickly became the definitive symbol of division, turning the vast, limitless American West into a patchwork of private land, and turning the battlefields of Europe into a paralyzing, static killing field. This is the story of how a simple wire, designed to keep cattle out, fundamentally redefined the concepts of freedom, ownership, and war. For decades after the American Civil War, the vast, central plains of the United States, the open range, were the domain of the cattle rancher. Millions of longhorn cattle roamed freely across state lines, following ancestral trails. Land ownership was loose, and the very idea of fencing millions of acres was ludicrous. The problem lay with the farmers, or homesteaders, who arrived later. They needed to protect their crops, wheat, corn, and grain, from the massive herds of wandering cattle. Traditional fencing, made from wood, was prohibitively expensive and scarce on the treeless prairies. This created perpetual conflict, the wire wars. Enter Joseph Glidden. In 1874, the DeKalb, Illinois farmer patented the design for simple, twin strands of wire with sharp, spiked barbs twisted into place at regular intervals. It was cheap, easy to transport by rail, and could be mass-produced at an unprecedented scale. Barbed wire was the revolutionary tool of control. A single man and a horse could now fence off hundreds of acres in a single day. The impact was instantaneous and irreversible. By the 1880s, homesteaders had used barbed wire to carve up the prairie. This led to fence-cutting wars, where cowboys and settlers literally fought over the ability to cross the land. But the outcome was certain: the open range was closed. The simple wire defined modern property rights. The land was no longer a communal resource. It was now a series of segregated parcels, protected by a simple, cruel barrier. Barbed wire transformed the American West from a land of limitless frontier myth into a disciplined, agricultural engine built on exclusive ownership. The wire's greatest, most horrifying legacy unfolded not on the American prairie, but on the fields of Flanders, thousands of miles away. As Europe plunged into World War I, armies discovered that the traditional strategies of mass infantry charges were rendered instantly obsolete by the machine gun. Defense became paramount. And what was the cheapest, most effective way to slow down an attacking force and channel them into a machine gun's field of fire? The simple, agricultural invention, barbed wire. The wire was not just used in a single line. It was laid in vast, thick, multi-layered belts across no man's land. It was strategically positioned to be nearly invisible in the muddy craters, and strong enough to trap a man by his uniform or boot. Barbed wire was the defining feature of trench warfare. It created a perfect paralysis. Infantry couldn't cross it quickly, and artillery fire often failed to cut all the strands, instead scattering the wire into an even more impenetrable mess. The American invention, designed to protect corn from cattle, had now created a human trap on a continental scale. The same mechanism that enforced private property in Texas now enforced a stalemate that killed millions in France and Belgium. The wire was cheap, deadly, and it immobilized the entire Western Front for 4 brutal years. It took the invention of the heavy tank, a machine specifically designed to crush the wire and cross the trenches, to finally break the technological deadlock created by a simple strand of metal. While the trench lines vanished, the legacy of barbed wire remains indelible. It has become a permanent feature of the modern landscape, signifying the power of the state to contain, restrict, and exclude. Look at its modern applications. Border walls and fences, barbed wire, and its more brutal successor, concertina razor wire, is a standard tool used by nations to police migration and enforce sovereignty. It is the cheapest statement of "you shall not pass." Prisons and detention. It is the ultimate physical barrier, symbolizing the deprivation of freedom and the enforcement of absolute control over the human body. Military installations. It remains the first line of defense, a physical deterrent that buys time for the armed response. Barbed wire, therefore, is more than just metal. It is a technology of exclusion. It embodies the political idea that space is finite, private, and must be aggressively defended against any perceived trespasser, whether that trespasser is a longhorn steer or a migrant seeking safety. The invention of barbed wire was driven by the most mundane of concerns: agricultural efficiency. Yet, its unintended consequences reshaped continents, ended one way of life, and paralyzed another. It fundamentally answered a simple human question with a revolutionary technology. How do you defend what is yours? The answer was simple, cheap, and brutally effective. The wire taught us that the boundaries we draw on maps are meaningless without a physical deterrent. And in the modern world, where borders are hardened and space is constantly contested, the quiet, persistent presence of that simple, twisted wire continues to dictate who is in and who is out. The age of the open range is over, replaced by a world entirely defined and divided by the legacy of the barb, the carrier of knowledge. In the vast narrative of human civilization, we often celebrate the grand inventions: the wheel, the printing press, the microchip. But what about the material that makes those inventions possible? The humble, unassuming surface upon which every idea, every law, and every scientific breakthrough is recorded. We are talking about paper. Paper is not just a medium, it is a catalyst. For centuries, knowledge was a privilege, guarded by high walls and exorbitant costs. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Reformation are universally credited to Gutenberg's printing press. But the press, magnificent as it was, needed fuel. That fuel was cheap, abundant, and revolutionary: paper. This is the story of how an affordable writing surface unlocked the intellectual capacity of an entire continent and democratized knowledge for the first time in history. To appreciate the impact of paper, we must understand the system it replaced. For most of the Middle Ages in Europe, the primary writing surface was parchment, treated animal hide, usually calfskin, goatskin, or sheepskin. Parchment was durable, but it was disastrously expensive and scarce. To produce a single large Bible required the skins of perhaps 300 animals and years of painstaking labor by scribes. Consequently, books were luxury goods, often locked away and guarded as treasures worth more than gold. This high cost created an intellectual bottleneck. Knowledge was centralized. It resided almost exclusively within the great monastic houses and royal courts. The spread of ideas was slow. Copying a text took months, ensuring that innovative ideas remained confined to small, elite circles. The literacy was restricted. There was simply not enough material available to teach the masses to read. The knowledge of the age was literally constrained by the size of Europe's livestock population. No matter how many brilliant ideas emerged, the material barrier of parchment ensured that knowledge remained the exclusive domain of power. The solution arrived indirectly. Paper, originally invented in China, was slowly brought westward through the Arab world, reaching Europe by the 12th century. But it wasn't the material itself that was revolutionary, it was the raw ingredient. European paper mills developed a technique utilizing cheap, abundant linen rags, discarded clothing, and fabric as their primary pulp source. This process required a fraction of the time and almost none of the materials needed for parchment. The impact was transformative. The cost of a blank sheet of paper dropped to a fraction of the cost of parchment. By the 15th century, Europe had solved its supply problem. A seemingly humble, waste product technology had unlocked an infinite supply of the raw material needed to record, distribute, and debate. When Johannes Gutenberg developed the movable type printing press around 1440, he wasn't working in a vacuum. His brilliant mechanical invention was perfectly timed for the massive, cheap supply of paper that had finally become available. The marriage of the printing press, the engine, and cheap rag paper, the fuel, created an unprecedented intellectual explosion. The speed and economy were staggering. What once took a scribe years to copy on expensive parchment could now be printed in hundreds of copies in a week on cheap paper. The cost plunged. The cost of a book dropped by up to 90% in some cases, shifting books from exclusive assets of the nobility to possessions attainable by merchants and urban tradesmen. The volume soared. Before the press, there were perhaps 30,000 books in all of Europe. 50 years after the press was invented, estimates suggest over 12 million books were in circulation. This flood of affordable knowledge was the secret engine of the Renaissance. Scholars could instantly access the works of ancient Greece and Rome, leading to rapid advances in art, science, and philosophy. But its greatest impact was political and religious. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church, his message did not rely on hand-copied manuscripts. His ideas were instantly reproduced on cheap paper and carried by merchants and travelers across the continent. The Protestant Reformation was, at its heart, a paper revolution. It provided the masses with affordable access to the Bible, empowering individual interpretation over centralized dogma, and fundamentally challenging the long-held monopoly of the church and crown over truth. Paper, the humble carrier of ideas, proved to be the ultimate democratizer. It made widespread literacy achievable, turned individual dissent into a mass movement, and paved the way for modern science and intellectual freedom. Every concept we now take for granted, universal education, democratic debate, and the free exchange of scientific discovery, rests on the foundation of that cheap, abundant supply of rag paper created centuries ago. Even today, in our digital age, the core principle remains. The easier and cheaper it is to reproduce and share information, the harder it is for any central authority to control knowledge. The legacy of the paper mill is clear. It didn't just give us a surface to write on. It gave us the freedom to think out loud. The mechanization of time. Every morning, the first command we obey is the sound of an alarm. It drags us from sleep, dictates our journey, and governs every minute of our working day. We feel that we manage time, but in reality, we are utterly managed by it. But this rigid obedience to the clock is not natural. For millennia, humanity lived by the sun, the seasons, and the natural rhythm of the body. So, how did a simple mechanical device, built of brass and gears, become the single most powerful tool of control in the modern world? This is the story of how the quest to measure God's time led to the brutal standardization of man's time, enabling the rise of global commerce, the factory system, and the very concept of industrial obedience. To understand our submission to the clock, we must first look to its birthplace, the medieval monastery. The earliest true mechanical clocks, emerging in 13th and 14th century Europe, were not invented for business or navigation. They were invented for God. Monastic life was structured around 7 precise daily prayer services or canonical hours. To ensure absolute uniformity, that every monk performed the service at the exact same moment, a device was needed that operated independently of the sun and the weather. The resulting mechanism was a technological marvel, designed to enforce a rigid, synchronized schedule on a community. It taught people that precision was possible and obedience was required. The clock, initially a religious tool for worship, soon escaped the monastery walls. As cities grew, the great clock towers of cathedrals and town halls became the new centers of time. The sound of the bell, the campana, told the artisan when to open his shop, the guild when to meet, and the citizen when to sleep. For the first time in history, human life was regulated not by the biological need to rest or the celestial movement of the sun, but by the arbitrary, mechanical rhythm of a machine. The age of standardized time had begun. As time became measurable, it became manageable, and as it became manageable, it became valuable. The shift was cemented during the 17th century with the powerful, now ubiquitous philosophical concept: time is money. This idea, often attributed to Benjamin Franklin, was not about efficiency. It was about commodification. The clock allowed time to be treated as a resource that could be bought, sold, wasted, or invested. This philosophical shift was the prerequisite for the Industrial Revolution. Before the factory, a worker often worked on a task-oriented schedule. A shoemaker worked until the shoes were finished. The rhythm was human. The factory system, however, demanded the mechanization of the human body itself. The steam engine did not care if the worker was tired or hungry. It operated on a rigid, predictable cycle. The mechanical clock became the master of the factory floor. It dictated when the gates opened, when the machine started, and when the worker was allowed a break. Wages were no longer paid for the product, but for the duration of the work, per hour. This allowed the factory owner to precisely measure, control, and, most crucially, exploit the smallest unit of human labor. The clock, far more effectively than any manager, enforced punctuality, speed, and endurance, the core tenets of industrial obedience. As industries expanded, the limitations of localized time became a logistical disaster. Imagine the chaos. In the mid-19th century, every major town and city in the United States operated on its own distinct time, set by the local noon. Boston's time was different from Philadelphia's, which was different from Chicago's. The complexity was maddening. But the emerging technology of the 19th century, the railroad, could not function under such anarchy. A timetable based on dozens of different local times was impossible to manage, leading to missed connections, severe delays, and dangerous head-on collisions. The chaos of natural time threatened the efficiency of the machine age. The solution was brutal standardization. In 1884, at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C., the world officially adopted the Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, and established global time zones. This was a monumental victory for the clock. This move effectively erased local culture's ancient reliance on the sun and replaced it with an arbitrary, invisible grid dictated by engineers and politicians. The world now operated on a single, synchronized rhythm, making global trade, communication, and transportation possible. This massive cultural sacrifice was deemed necessary because the needs of the machine now outweighed the needs of the human. The legacy of the mechanical clock is profound. It taught us that time is a quantifiable, finite resource, and that personal efficiency is the highest virtue. From the medieval monastery bell to the railway timetable, and now to the relentless notifications on our smartphones, we continue to live as subjects of the clock. We are constantly tracked, measured, and judged by the rhythm of a machine designed centuries ago. The clock did not just measure time. It created the very structure of the modern world. It industrialized our labor, monetized our minutes, and enforced the obedience necessary for the capitalist system to flourish. The question remains, after all these centuries of synchronization, have we truly mastered time, or has time, and the simple, ticking mechanism that measures it, finally mastered us?